January 1945. Somewhere in the Philippine jungle. The air hung heavy with moisture and the metallic scent of fear. Through the tangled vines and shattered palms, a column of exhausted figures moved slowly toward the American encampment. 23 Japanese prisoners of war, their uniforms torn and stained dark with sweat and mud. Among them walked something the young Marine Guards had not expected to see. 7 women, their faces drawn tight with terror, clutching infants against their chests. The babies were silent, unnaturally so, as if they too understood that survival depended on invisibility. One woman stumbled, catching herself against a rubber tree, and the infant in her arms let out a thin cry that cut through the humid silence like a blade. She pressed the child closer, her eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply the last words she expected to speak on this earth. The Marines watched, uncertain, as the prisoners were led through the wire. In that moment, 2 entirely different understandings of warfare, of honor, of what happened to the defeated, stood face to face in the fading light of a tropical afternoon. For these Japanese women and their children, the next hours would not bring what every fiber of their being had been conditioned to expect. Instead, they would witness something that would shatter the fundamental architecture of everything they had been taught about the enemy, about surrender, about the nature of the Americans who now held their lives in their hands. What followed would become one of the thousands of small, undocumented revolutions that occurred in prisoner-of-war camps across the Pacific, moments where ideology met reality, where propaganda dissolved in the face of human decency, where the machinery of total war revealed fissures through which something older and more fundamental could emerge. This is the story of mothers who expected execution and found nurseries, of soldiers who had been taught that surrender meant dishonor, discovering that their captors measured honor differently, of tiny acts of construction that dismantled years of carefully built hatred. It is a story told in lumber and nails and powdered milk, in the stunned silence of women waiting to die, in the calloused hands of farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit who found themselves building cradles in the ruins of war. The Japanese military code of Bushido, as interpreted and weaponized by the wartime regime, left no ambiguity about surrender. The 1941 Field Service Code, distributed to every Japanese soldier, stated explicitly, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid leaving behind a name soiled by disgrace." This was not metaphor or suggestion. It was absolute doctrine, drilled into every recruit from the moment they entered service. To be captured alive was to cease being Japanese in any meaningful sense, to become something less than human, a creature of shame who had severed all connection to family, nation, and the divine ancestry of the emperor himself. The families of those who surrendered would be notified of their deaths, regardless of their actual survival, because in every way that mattered to the military society of wartime Japan, they were dead. The code made surrender equivalent to treason, cowardice, and spiritual annihilation combined into a single unforgivable act. For Japanese women who found themselves in war zones, nurses, comfort women brought under false pretenses, civilians trapped by the rapid advance of American forces, the calculus was even more brutal. The propaganda films shown throughout Japan and its occupied territories portrayed American soldiers as bestial subhumans who raped without mercy, who tortured prisoners for sport, who killed children and desecrated the dead. These were not presented as the excesses of war, but as the natural behavior of a racially inferior enemy, demons in human form whose victory would mean not just death, but defilement. Japanese schoolchildren were shown footage of Chinese women allegedly murdered by American-supplied Chinese forces. The images grainy and horrific, accompanied by narration that promised the same fate awaited every Japanese woman if the Americans won. On Saipan in July 1944, this indoctrination bore its darkest fruit when hundreds of Japanese civilians, including mothers with infants, threw themselves from cliffs rather than face capture. American soldiers and Marines watched in horror as women clutched their children and stepped into empty air, choosing certain death over the imagined horrors of American captivity. The cliffs became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, monuments to the effectiveness of propaganda, to the terrible power of ideas to override even the most fundamental human instinct for survival. The 7 women who arrived at the American camp in that Philippine jungle in January 1945 carried these expectations like stones in their stomachs. They had seen what they believed was evidence: whispered stories from soldiers, propaganda leaflets, the absolute certainty in their officers' voices when they described what the Americans would do to captured women. As they were separated from the male prisoners and led toward a separate compound, some began to weep silently. Others stared straight ahead with the blank expression of those who have already died inside. One woman, her infant perhaps 6 months old, began singing softly. A lullaby, witnesses would later recall, though the words were lost in the sounds of the camp. She sang as if to carry her child across the threshold of death on a cradle of melody, to make the passage gentle even if the method would not be. The Marine Guards, most of them barely out of their teens, shifted uncomfortably and said nothing. They had no framework for this terror, no way to understand that these women were saying goodbye not just to life, but to any hope of dying with dignity. What the women could not know, what their propaganda had never prepared them to imagine, was that the American military had spent years developing a comprehensive approach to prisoner-of-war treatment based on the Geneva Conventions and on a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and despite Japan's refusal to ratify it, American policy directed that all prisoners be treated according to its provisions. This was not altruism, but a calculated blend of legal obligation, moral philosophy, and practical strategy. American military doctrine held that proper treatment of prisoners enhanced the likelihood of reciprocal treatment for captured American personnel, encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, and demonstrated the moral superiority of the Allied cause to neutral observers and occupied populations. But beneath the strategic calculations lay something more fundamental: a belief, perhaps naive but nonetheless real, that there were limits to what war should do to human beings, that even in total conflict certain boundaries should hold. The implementation of this policy across the vast Pacific theater was inconsistent, shaped by local commanders, by the intensity of recent combat, by the resources available at any given camp. Some camps were harsh, offering only the minimum required by regulation, places where the guards and the guarded eyed each other with undiluted hatred across the wire. But many others evolved into something more complex, particularly as the war progressed and the number of prisoners increased. By January 1945, the American military held thousands of Japanese prisoners of war across camps in Hawaii, the continental United States, and advanced bases in the Pacific. The prisoners in these camps were discovering, day by bewildering day, that they had not been executed upon capture, that they were being fed, that they were allowed to write letters and organize cultural activities, that the Americans seemed almost embarrassed by their captivity rather than triumphant. This created its own kind of psychological crisis. How does one reconcile years of indoctrination with the reality of captors who offer cigarettes and medical care? The camp where the 7 women and their children arrived was under the command of Captain James Morrison, a former schoolteacher from Oregon who had joined the Army in 1942 and found himself, through the mysterious logic of military assignment, responsible for processing and housing prisoners in a forward area behind the American advance through Luzon. Morrison was 34 years old, married father to 2 daughters he had not seen in 18 months. His official orders regarding prisoners were clear: secure them, document them, ensure they received adequate food and medical care, and prepare them for transfer to rear area facilities. The orders said nothing specifically about prisoners with infants, because the scenario planners back in Washington had not imagined that American forces would be capturing Japanese women with babies in any significant numbers. Morrison would have to improvise, guided by regulation, conscience, and the practical problem of how to house nursing mothers in a facility designed for enemy combatants. When Morrison first saw the women being led through the camp, he felt something shift in his chest, a recognition, perhaps, that cut through the careful psychological distance an officer maintains from the enemy. These were not soldiers. They were mothers, terrified mothers, holding babies who looked sick and malnourished. One infant was clearly running a fever, its face flushed, its whimper weak. Morrison's administrative mind immediately categorized the problems: inadequate housing, lack of appropriate nutrition, need for medical screening, the security question of how to house women separately from male prisoners in a camp that had no facilities designed for gender separation. But underneath the administrative response was something more primal. His own daughters' faces superimposed on these enemy children, the universal terror in the mother's eyes that transcended nation and uniform. He turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant Samuel Chen, a Nisei from California whose Japanese language skills had made him invaluable in prisoner operations. "Ask them if any of the children need immediate medical attention," Morrison said, "and find out what they're so afraid of." Chen approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, and spoke in Japanese. The sound of their own language from this American soldier's mouth seemed to startle the women more than anything else had. One of them, older than the others, perhaps 35, raised her head and responded. Her voice was barely audible. Chen listened, his expression carefully neutral, then turned back to Morrison. "Sir, they believe we're going to execute them. The older woman asks only that we do it quickly, and that they be allowed to hold their children when it happens." Morrison stared at Chen for a long moment. "They think we're going to murder women and babies?" Chen nodded slowly. "That's what they've been taught about us, Captain. That's what every Japanese soldier and civilian has been told. That we're savages who torture prisoners and rape women. They've seen the propaganda. On Saipan, thousands of civilians killed themselves rather than be captured. These women are waiting to die." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind moving through the damaged trees and the distant clatter of construction equipment. Morrison felt the weight of what Chen had just translated. Not just the words, but the worldview behind them. The vast gulf of incomprehension that separated these terrified women from the reality of who he and his men actually were. He thought about his own daughters, about the bedtime stories and the school plays and the scraped knees he had kissed. He thought about the men under his command, farm boys and mechanics and shop clerks, most of them decent men who wrote letters home about how much they missed their mother's cooking and their girlfriends' letters. The idea that these women saw them as monsters, as creatures who would murder infants, created a kind of sick anger in him, not at the women, but at whatever system had so thoroughly poisoned their understanding of reality. "Tell them no one is going to be harmed," Morrison said quietly. "Tell them they are prisoners of war under the protection of the United States Army, and that they and their children will be cared for according to military regulations and international law. Tell them we need to examine the children to make sure they're healthy, and we need to find them proper housing. Tell them—" He paused, searching for words that could bridge the unbridgeable. "Tell them they're safe now," Chen translated, and Morrison watched the women's faces as his words reached them. There was no immediate relief, no tears of gratitude, no visible softening. Instead, there was confusion, suspicion, the look of people hearing something that makes no sense in their understanding of the world. The older woman said something else, her tone challenging. Chen translated, "She asks why we would lie to them. She says it would be more honorable to kill them quickly than to torture them with false hope." Morrison felt exhaustion wash over him. The exhaustion of trying to prove basic humanity to someone who has been taught that you have none. "We're not lying," he said. "Chen, take them to the medical tent. Get the corpsman to check all the children. Any that need treatment, treat them. Find me Sergeant Williams and tell him I need to see him. Immediately." "Master Sergeant Robert?" Williams was a 40-year-old carpenter from Detroit, who had been too old for combat infantry but whose construction skills had made him invaluable in forward operations. He had built or supervised the building of half the structures in the camp: barracks, latrines, medical facilities, storage sheds, working with whatever materials could be scrounged or requisitioned. When he reported to Morrison's tent, He found the captain studying a hand-drawn map of the camp, pencil in hand. "Williams, we've got a problem," Morrison began. "We just received 7 female prisoners with infants. The existing POW compound isn't suitable for housing women with babies. I need you to build something appropriate. Separate structure, secure but not oppressive, with space for 7 women and 7 infants. It needs to provide privacy, protection from the elements, and—" He paused, thinking about those terrified faces. "It needs to not feel like a cell. These women think we're going to kill them. I want them housed in something that makes clear we're not monsters." Williams listened, his weathered face thoughtful. He had 3 children back home, including a baby daughter born 2 months before he shipped out, whom he had seen only in photographs. "How long do we have, sir?" Morrison checked his watch. "It's 1600 now. I want them out of the temporary holding area by tomorrow evening. Can you do it?" Williams nodded slowly. "I'll need every spare man not on guard duty, and I'll need to requisition materials from the engineer depot. But yes, sir, we can do it." He hesitated, then added, "My boys will want to know what they're building and why. Once word gets around that we've got women prisoners with babies." Morrison met his eyes. "Tell them the truth. Tell them we're building a nursery for prisoners of war, because that's what civilized armies do. Tell them these women are terrified and their children are sick, and we're Americans, and we don't make war on babies. Any man who has a problem with that can come see me." What happened over the next 36 hours would become one of those stories that soldiers tell and retell, that gets written in letters home, that shapes how men understand their own participation in war. Williams assembled a working party of 23 men drawn from various units in the camp. When he explained what they were building, there was a moment of surprised silence. Then a kind of energy emerged that he had not anticipated. These were men who had been fighting or supporting combat operations for months, men who had seen friends die, who had grown calloused to suffering and death because callousness was the only way to function. The opportunity to build something life-affirming rather than destroy, to protect rather than attack, seemed to unlock something in them. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, a former framer from Los Angeles, appointed himself assistant crew chief without being asked. Corporal Thomas Reed, whose infant son had died of illness 2 years earlier, worked with fierce intensity, barely speaking. Sergeant William Blackwood, who in civilian life had taught shop class at a Negro high school in Georgia, and who served in the segregated 93rd Infantry Division attached to the camp, brought his entire squad to volunteer their off-duty time, working alongside white soldiers with a naturalness that the United States Army's official policy said should not exist. The structure that took shape was modest but carefully conceived. Williams designed it as a single large room, 20 feet by 30 feet, with a covered porch area and a separate small room that could serve as a privacy area for nursing or for treating sick children. The frame went up first, lumber requisitioned from engineer supplies and supplemented with salvaged materials from destroyed Japanese structures. The men worked through the humid afternoon and into the evening, erecting walls, fitting roof panels, hanging a door that could be secured from the inside, a detail that Williams insisted on, over the questions of security-minded officers, because he understood that these women needed to feel they had some control over their own space. The floor was raised on short pilings to keep it dry during tropical rains. Windows were screened but left unbarred, offering ventilation and light. Inside, the carpenters built 7 sleeping platforms, each wide enough for a woman and infant, with raised edges that would prevent babies from rolling off during sleep. Martinez contributed a detail he remembered from his own home: a shelf above each sleeping platform where the women could place personal items, creating a tiny territory of privacy and shared space. As word of the construction project spread through the camp, soldiers began contributing items without being asked. Someone brought mosquito netting, enough to drape over each sleeping platform. The medical corpsman sent over a crate containing clean blankets, actually clean, requisitioned from supplies meant for American personnel. A cook from the mess tent arrived with bars of soap, real soap, and a bucket of cloth diapers he had somehow acquired. Chaplain William Foster, a Methodist minister from Iowa, brought a kerosene lamp and several candles, then stayed to help with construction, even though his hands were soft and unpracticed with hammer and nail. By the time darkness fell on the first day, the frame stood complete and roofed, and the men erected work lights to continue through the evening. They worked mostly in silence, with the focused intensity of men building something that mattered, driven by motivations they might have struggled to articulate, but felt clearly nonetheless. Meanwhile, in the medical tent, the 7 women were discovering another aspect of American captivity that their indoctrination had not prepared them for. The corpsmen who examined the children were young, barely older than the women themselves, and manifestly uncomfortable with the task. They worked gently, speaking in soft tones even though the women could not understand their words, using cloth dolls to demonstrate to worried mothers what examination they wanted to perform before touching each child. 3 of the infants were suffering from malnutrition, their bellies distended, their skin showing the beginning signs of dietary deficiency diseases. One had a fever that the senior corpsman, a former pharmacy student named Albert Chen, no relation to Lieutenant Chen, identified as probably being an upper respiratory infection. Another had a suppurating wound on her leg, inflamed and dangerous. The corpsmen treated what they could immediately, cleaning the wound with painful thoroughness while the infant screamed, and the mother held her, face wet with tears. Rehydration salts mixed into water for the malnourished children, aspirin for the fever, clean dressings, gentle hands. The head nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, was one of only 3 women on the camp's staff, an Army Nurse Corps officer who had been assigned to the forward area because of the shortage of medical personnel. She watched the corpsmen work, then made a decision that would technically violate protocol, but which her conscience demanded. She approached the oldest of the Japanese women, the one who had spoken to Lieutenant Chen earlier, and through gestures and simple words supplemented by Chen's translation, she offered to help the women clean themselves and their children. The look that passed between the 2 women in that moment carried a communication deeper than language. One mother to another, one woman to another, across the vast divide of war and nation. Mitchell heated water on a camp stove and brought washcloths and towels. She showed the women where they could bathe in privacy, staying nearby to help but not intruding unless asked. When one infant began to cry during his bath, Mitchell picked him up without thinking, performing the universal mother's bounce and sway, humming tunelessly, and the child quieted. The Japanese mother watched this enemy woman comfort her son, and something in her face broke. Not tears yet, but a fracture in the wall of expected horror. That night, the women were housed temporarily in a section of the medical tent, separated by canvas curtains from the rest of the facility. They slept poorly, if at all, still waiting for the violence they had been promised would come. But what came instead, at first light, was Lieutenant Chen with breakfast, rice porridge, prepared specially by the mess sergeant who had been told about the prisoner's condition, supplemented with powdered milk for the children. Chen explained through translation that their permanent housing was being prepared and would be ready by evening. The older woman, whose name was Kimura Sachiko, asked the question that had kept her awake all night. "Why have you not killed us?" Chen was quiet for a moment before responding in Japanese. "Because we do not kill prisoners. Because you are mothers, and those are children. Because that is not who we are, no matter what you have been told." Sachiko's response was soft, almost inaudible. "We did not know it was possible for this to be true." The construction of the nursery continued through the second day with expanded ambition. Private First Class David Zimmerman, a former electrician, ran a power line from the camp's generator to the structure, installing electric lights, a luxury that exceeded regulation, but which no officer moved to stop. The carpenters built a large table and benches where the women could eat together, cook if they desired, work on whatever tasks they chose. Someone constructed a storage cabinet for supplies. Corporal Reed worked for 3 hours carving and sanding wooden toys, simple blocks, and a pull toy horse, which he left without comment on one of the sleeping platforms, his face averted so no one could see his expression. Sergeant Blackwood and his squad built a small washing area attached to the structure, with a drainage system and a privacy screen, so the women would not have to walk through the camp to maintain hygiene. The attention to detail went beyond regulation, beyond necessity, into the realm of statement, a physical argument, made in wood and nails, about the difference between what these women had been taught to expect and what they would actually experience. By late afternoon of the second day, Captain Morrison inspected the completed structure with Lieutenant Chen and Sergeant Williams. What had been a bare plot of ground 40 hours earlier was now a secure, clean, well-lit building that managed to feel both protective and respectful. Morrison walked through slowly, noting the details. The door that locked from the inside, the individual sleeping spaces, the toys, the lamp, the electric lights, the washing area, the covered porch where women could sit in the air without being directly exposed to the general camp population. "Sergeant Williams," Morrison said finally, "this is outstanding work. Please convey my thanks and commendation to every man who worked on this." Williams nodded, and Morrison caught something in his expression. "Something else, Sergeant?" Williams hesitated. "The men wanted me to ask, sir, permission to contribute some of our own rations to make sure those babies have enough milk and food. The official POW ration is adequate for adults, but for infants—" Morrison felt something tighten in his throat. "Permission granted. Set up a voluntary contribution system. No one pressured to give, but anyone who wants to contribute can." When the 7 women and their children were led to the new structure, they moved slowly, warily, surrounded by guards but not constrained by them. It was late afternoon, the tropical sun slanting through the damaged forest canopy, the air slightly cooler than it had been during the day's heat. As they approached and saw the building for the first time, they stopped. Sachiko, at the front of the group, stared at the structure, clean, newly built, clearly just constructed, with its raised floor and screened windows and solid door. She said something in Japanese, her voice bewildered. Chen, translating for Captain Morrison, who had come to witness the transfer, said, "She asks if this was built for them." Morrison nodded. "Tell her yes. Tell her it was built by American soldiers specifically to house her and the other mothers and children. Tell her it's theirs for as long as they're in this camp." Chen translated, and the reaction was immediate and shattering. Sachiko's face contorted, and she began to weep, not quiet tears but wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. The other women stared at the building, at the guards, at Captain Morrison, with expressions of confusion giving way to something like shock. One of the younger women, her infant clutched against her shoulder, sank to her knees in the dirt, crying so hard she struggled to breathe. Another stood frozen, tears running down her face, repeating something over and over. Chen's own voice was unsteady as he translated. "She says they thought we would execute them. She keeps saying they thought we would kill their children." Morrison felt his own eyes burning. He had seen men die, had ordered men into situations where he knew some would not return, had developed the emotional armor necessary to function in war. But this, the spectacle of women weeping not from pain, but from the shock of discovering they would be allowed to live, that their children would be fed, that their captors had built them a nursery. This penetrated every defense he had constructed. The women entered the structure slowly, like people entering a temple, touching the walls as if to confirm they were real. They examined the sleeping platforms, the mosquito netting, the table, the toys that Corporal Reed had carved. One woman picked up the wooden horse, turning it over in her hands, and said something to Sachiko. Chen translated. "She asks if American soldiers made this. She cannot believe that soldiers would make toys for enemy children." Lieutenant Mitchell, who had accompanied the group, moved forward with a crate she had brought from medical supplies. Inside were bottles, clean cloths, more soap, a supply of powdered milk sufficient for several days. She set it down and tried to communicate through gestures that more would be provided as needed. Sachiko bowed deeply, a formal bow of profound respect and gratitude, and Mitchell, uncertain, bowed back. The two women's eyes met, and Mitchell said in English, knowing Sachiko could not understand the words but hoping the tone would carry, "You're safe. Your babies are safe. I promise you're safe." That evening, as the women settled into their new quarters, something unprecedented happened in the camp. Word had spread among the American personnel about the prisoners' initial terror, about their belief that they would be executed, about the construction of the nursery and the women's reaction when they saw it. During the evening meal, soldiers who had not been involved in the construction began arriving at the structure, maintaining a respectful distance, but watching. They came in ones and twos at first, then in small groups, simply observing. Some brought additional contributions: a cloth that could serve as a baby blanket, a small mirror, a cup, a spoon. They left these items outside the door and departed without seeking acknowledgement. Chaplain Foster, observing this, was reminded of medieval pilgrims leaving offerings at shrines, though what these soldiers were venerating was not clear even to themselves. Perhaps simply the idea that something nurturing could exist within the machinery of war. Perhaps the relief of acting according to the better angels of their nature, rather than the darker demands of combat. The transformation of the 7 women over the following days was gradual but profound. The first morning, they woke in the nursery expecting perhaps to discover it had been a temporary reprieve, that the execution or abuse they anticipated would now begin. Instead, they were brought breakfast, rice porridge again, with extra milk for the children, and some canned fruit that someone had contributed. Lieutenant Chen arrived mid-morning to explain, through careful translation, the camp rules that would govern their detention. They were restricted to the immediate area around the nursery except for medical visits. They would be provided with adequate food and supplies for themselves and their children. They would be allowed to maintain their own cultural and religious practices, insofar as these did not conflict with camp security. They were under the protection of the United States Army, and any mistreatment should be reported immediately. Chen delivered this information in formal Japanese, using respectful grammatical structures that conveyed that he was addressing them as people worthy of courtesy, rather than as defeated enemies worthy only of contempt. Sachiko listened carefully, then asked a series of questions that revealed the vast gulf between her expectations and her current reality. Would they be forced to labor? No, Chen explained, not while caring for infants. Lactating mothers and mothers of young children were exempt from work details under the Geneva Convention protocols the United States followed. Would they be used for medical experiments? Chen's face showed shock at the question, and he explained firmly that no, medical care was provided for their benefit, not for experimentation, and they could refuse any treatment they did not want. Would their children be taken from them? No, absolutely not. The children would remain with their mothers at all times. Sachiko absorbed these answers and then asked the question that cut deepest. Why are you doing this? Why do you treat us with such... She struggled for words. With such humanity, when we are your enemies, and we deserve death. Chen looked at Captain Morrison, who had been listening even though he could not understand the Japanese. Morrison, through Chen, gave the answer that would be remembered and repeated, that would find its way into letters home and eventually into historical accounts. We treat you this way because this is who we are. You are not our enemies. You are mothers and children who have been caught in a war you did not start and cannot control. We are Americans. This is what America means. The children, being young and resilient, adapted first. Within a week, the infants were gaining weight on the supplemented diet, their skin taking on healthier color, their cries becoming stronger. The toddlers, once they realized that the large foreign men in uniform were not threats, began to show curiosity. The corpsmen who came daily to check on the children's health became familiar, welcome presences. Albert Chen, the pharmacy student turned corpsman, developed a particular bond with the youngest infant, a 6-month-old boy named Takeshi, who had been severely malnourished when captured. Chen made it his personal mission to save this child, spending his off-duty time researching infant nutrition, requisitioning special supplies, monitoring Takeshi's weight gain with meticulous records. When Takeshi smiled for the first time, a real, healthy baby smile at some silly face Chen was making, the corpsman felt an emotion he later described in a letter to his parents as like winning a battle without any weapons, like defeating death by just being stubborn and kind. The women's transformation was slower, marked by tentative tests of the boundaries of their new reality. Would the guards react with violence if approached with questions? No. They were polite, sometimes helpful, occasionally embarrassed by the language barrier but never threatening. Would food be withheld as punishment? No. It arrived regularly, and the quality actually improved, as the mess sergeant made special efforts to provide rice prepared in Japanese style, and to include foods that nursing mothers needed. When one of the women became ill with a fever, would she be left to suffer or recover on her own? No. Lieutenant Mitchell came immediately when informed, examined her with concern, provided medicine, checked on her recovery daily. Each of these small revelations, each moment when the expected cruelty failed to materialize, chipped away at the edifice of propaganda and indoctrination these women had carried. The symbolic center of this transformation became the nursery itself, the building that had been constructed in 36 hours of focused effort, by men who would never know the full impact of their work, became a kind of embassy of a different world, a physical manifestation of values that the women had been taught did not exist in their enemies. They kept it meticulously clean, maintaining the structure with a care that went beyond mere maintenance into something like reverence. Sachiko organized the other women into a schedule for cleaning, cooking, and child care that gave structure to their days and maintained their dignity as people capable of managing their own lives, rather than as helpless captives. When Sergeant Williams came by to check on the building's condition and to make minor repairs, he found it in better condition than most of the American barracks, every surface scrubbed, every item in its place. The wooden toys Reed had carved polished, smooth from handling and carefully stored when not in use. It was during one of these maintenance visits that Williams had a conversation with Sachiko that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Lieutenant Chen was translating, and Williams had just finished repairing a door hinge that had worked loose. Sachiko bowed her thanks, then asked Chen to convey a question. Would Williams permit her to know the names of the men who had built the nursery? Williams was surprised by the request but saw no security risk in providing names. He listed the primary crew: Martinez, Reed, Blackwood, Zimmerman, himself, and nearly 24 others who had contributed significant work. Sachiko listened to each name, repeating them carefully to commit them to memory. Then she said something that Chen translated haltingly. Please tell them that we are mothers who expected to die, and now our children live because of what they built. Tell them that we will teach our children these American names, so that when they are older they will know the names of the men who gave them life. Tell them that we do not understand how we can ever repay such kindness to enemies. But we will remember, and our children will remember, and perhaps someday this will matter. Williams had no prepared response to this. He stood in the nursery, hammer in hand, looking at this Japanese woman who was maybe 10 years younger than him, who had expected to be murdered and was now promising to teach her child his name. He thought about his own children back in Detroit, about the world he wanted them to grow up in, about what it meant to build versus destroy. Finally, he said, knowing Chen would translate, "We built this because we're fathers and brothers and sons. We built it because those are babies, and they deserve to be safe and warm and fed. We don't need to be repaid. We just need you to keep them safe and help them grow up in a better world than this one." When Chen finished translating, Sachiko bowed again, deeply, and when she straightened, Williams saw tears on her face. No more words were necessary. He gathered his tools and left, nodding to the woman at the door who was nursing her infant on the porch, rocking slowly in the afternoon heat. As weeks passed and became months, the nursery settlement developed its own rhythms and routines that existed in strange parallel to the war still raging across the Pacific. The women organized lessons for the older children, teaching them Japanese characters drawn in dirt with sticks, singing traditional songs that drifted across the camp and created moments of surreal juxtaposition. The voice of a Japanese mother singing a lullaby while American soldiers cleaned weapons nearby. They cooked when provided with ingredients, preparing foods in the Japanese style, and occasionally, tentatively, offered samples to the guards or staff who came by. Lieutenant Mitchell developed a particular appreciation for rice balls wrapped in seaweed, a simple food that reminded her of the onigiri she had tried during a visit to Hawaii before the war. These small exchanges of food, of recipes, of acknowledgement that different cultures had different approaches to the universal tasks of feeding children and maintaining households, built bridges that no diplomatic negotiation could have constructed. The mail system created unexpected complications and revelations. Under Geneva Convention protocols, prisoners of war were allowed to send and receive mail, subject to censorship for security purposes. But these women had been declared dead by the Japanese military, their families notified of their deaths in battle or their honorable suicides. To suddenly receive mail from them would create administrative and ideological problems for the Japanese military bureaucracy. The American camp authorities grappled with this situation, eventually deciding to allow the women to write letters home, but warning them that it was uncertain whether the letters would be delivered, or what consequences their families might face if they were. Sachiko chose to write anyway, composing a carefully worded letter to her parents that expressed her survival and that of her daughter without providing details that might create problems. She gave the letter to Lieutenant Chen with no real expectation it would reach its destination. Months later, in one of the war's small miracles, she would receive a reply. Her father had received her letter through mysterious channels, probably through Red Cross intermediaries, and he wrote back that while he could not acknowledge her survival publicly, he thanked the Buddha that she lived and prayed for her continued safety. The letter said nothing about whether he faced consequences for receiving mail from a daughter who was officially dead. The children, meanwhile, grew. Takeshi, the infant who had been near death from malnutrition, became a healthy, chubby baby who laughed readily and had somehow adopted Albert Chen as a secondary attachment figure. The Cormans' daily visits had become routine, expected, and Takeshi would reach for him with the guileless trust that only the very young can offer. Chen, who was Chinese-American and whose own family had fled Japanese occupation in China, found himself the devoted caretaker of a Japanese infant, an irony that was not lost on him, but which somehow felt right. He wrote to his parents in California about Takeshi, about the strange experience of loving an enemy child, about how the baby didn't know anything about nations or wars, just that Chen made funny faces and held him gently. His parents wrote back with cautious approval, noting that the baby had not chosen his country any more than Chen had chosen his own, and that kindness to the innocent could never be wrong. By spring of 1945, as the war moved inexorably toward its conclusion, the nursery settlement had become a fixture of the camp, a place that existed in awkward tension with the primary mission of preparing to fight and defeat Japan. New prisoners who arrived were sometimes brought past the nursery as part of their initial processing, and their reactions to seeing Japanese women and children housed safely, their children healthy and playing, their surroundings clean and maintained, created a kind of propaganda more effective than any leaflet or broadcast. Some of the newly arrived prisoners broke down upon seeing it, overcome by the dissonance between their expectations and this reality. Others became sullenly angry, viewing the women as cowards who had betrayed the empire by surrendering. But most simply absorbed the sight in silence, processing the information slowly, beginning the long psychological journey from enemy soldier to prisoner of war to, perhaps eventually, person willing to imagine a different future. Captain Morrison received orders in late April to prepare for the transfer of all non-combatant prisoners, including the women and children, to a rear area facility in Hawaii where they would remain for the duration of the war. The orders made administrative sense. The camp in the Philippines was too close to active combat operations to be suitable for long-term detention of women and children. But Morrison felt something tighten in his chest when he read the transfer directive. Over the past months, these women and their children had become part of the fabric of his camp, their presence a reminder of why the war was being fought and what kind of nation America aspired to be. He thought about how to communicate the transfer order, about how the women might react, about whether they would see it as another broken promise or as further evidence of American duplicity. When Lieutenant Chen translated the transfer orders to the women, their reaction was complex. Relief that they would be moving further from active combat zones, anxiety about the unknown facility they were being sent to, and unexpectedly sadness at leaving the nursery and the American personnel they had come to trust. Sachiko asked if they could take some of the toys that Corporal Reed had carved, small physical anchors to this place and time. Morrison approved immediately and authorized the women to take any personal items they could carry. The night before the transfer, Sergeant Williams and several of the original construction crew came to the nursery to make any final repairs needed and to say goodbye. It was an awkward visit, heavy with things that could not easily be expressed across the barrier of language and nation. Williams brought a photograph of his own children, showing it to Sachiko, and she understood without translation. These men had built a nursery for enemy children because they were fathers who could not bear to see any child suffer. She brought out a small cloth bag she had sewn from scraps. Inside it 7 carefully folded papers, each bearing the names of her fellow mothers and their children, written in both Japanese characters and Roman letters, along with the names of the American soldiers who had built the nursery. Williams took the bag, uncertain what he was meant to do with it. Through Chen's translation, Sachiko explained, "This is our memory. This is the proof that we lived and were shown mercy. Someday, when the war is over, we will tell our children what you did, and they will tell their children, and your names will be remembered not as enemies, but as the men who built a nursery in the middle of war." The morning of departure came too quickly. The women and children were loaded onto trucks for the first leg of their journey to the coast, where they would board a ship for Hawaii. The American personnel not on essential duty turned out to watch them go, not in formation or as an official ceremony, but simply as individuals who had become invested in these lives. Corporal Reed stood at the edge of the assembly area, his face impassive, watching Sachiko's daughter clutch the wooden horse he had carved. Albert Chen held Takeshi one last time, the baby now healthy and bright-eyed, babbling in the universal pre-language of infants everywhere. He handed the child back to his mother and said in Japanese, "Take care of him. He's a fighter." The mother bowed, tears on her face, and replied, "He fights because you gave him strength. We will tell him about the American soldier who saved his life." As the trucks pulled away, trailing dust in the morning light, Chaplain Foster stood with Captain Morrison watching them disappear. The chaplain said quietly, "I've been thinking about what this means, all of this, the nursery, the care we gave them, everything. In the Old Testament, there's a concept, hesed, loving kindness that goes beyond obligation or law, kindness that springs from the nature of who you are rather than what you're required to do. That's what happened here. Those men built that nursery not because regulations demanded it, but because they could not do otherwise and remain who they were. That's hesed. That's the work that echoes in eternity." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "I hope you're right, Chaplain. I hope this matters. Because some days it feels like we're building nurseries on one side of the camp while we're training men to kill on the other, and I'm not sure how to reconcile that." Foster nodded slowly. "We don't have to reconcile it. We just have to do the right thing in each moment we're given. Those women expected execution and got a nursery. Those children expected death and got life. That's what we gave them. Whatever else happens in this war, we gave them that. It matters." The women and children arrived safely in Hawaii, where they were housed in a facility designed for civilian internees that, while not luxurious, provided stability and security for the remainder of the war. Sachiko would later write in a memoir published decades after the war ended about her experience of captivity. She described the terror of those first days, the certainty of death, the incomprehensible shock of the nursery. She wrote, "We had been taught that Americans were demons without mercy, that they would torture and kill prisoners without hesitation. When we saw that building, when we understood it had been built for us by enemy soldiers who had taken time and care to make it suitable for mothers and babies, something fundamental broke inside us. Not our spirits, but our certainty that we understood the world. If our enemies could show such kindness, what else had we been wrong about? If soldiers we expected to kill us instead built us a nursery, what did that say about the nature of war and humanity?" These questions haunted us for years, even after we returned to Japan. They haunt me still. After the war, some of the soldiers who had been involved with the Nursery project tried to find out what had happened to the women and children. The military bureaucracy was not designed for such inquiries, and most got no response. But Sergeant Williams, persistent and methodical, eventually made contact through church organizations and Red Cross channels with Sachiko, who had returned to Japan and was rebuilding her life. They exchanged letters, stilted at first, constrained by translation and by the weight of history, but gradually becoming more personal. Sachiko sent photographs of her daughter, healthy and growing, still keeping the wooden horse that Corporal Reed had carved. Williams sent photographs of his own children, now grown. They never met in person, but they maintained correspondence for years, an improbable friendship forged in the crucible of war and sustained by the memory of a nursery built in 36 hours by men who could have chosen cruelty, but chose mercy instead. Corporal Thomas Reed, who had carved toys for children whose nation had killed his own infant son, never spoke much about his experience in the war. But his daughter, sorting through his effects after his death in 1982, found a small notebook in which he had written only a few entries. One, dated April 1945, read, "Today I made toys for Japanese children, enemy children, and it felt like the most important thing I have done in this whole damn war. I made them because children should have toys. I made them because Sarah would have wanted me to. I made them because if I become a man who cannot see the humanity in a child, then the war has taken more from me than just my daughter. It has taken who I am. I will not let that happen. So I made toys, and I sanded them smooth so they could not hurt small hands, and I hope those children play with them and grow up, and maybe someday remember that even in war, even between enemies, someone cared enough to make them toys." Albert Chen maintained interest in pediatric health after the war, eventually attending medical school on the GI Bill and becoming a pediatrician in San Francisco. In his office, among the degrees and certificates, hung a photograph of an emaciated infant, Takeshi, taken during his first examination in the camp medical tent. Beside it hung a photograph taken 3 months later of the same child, now chubby and healthy, smiling at the camera. Chen would sometimes show these photographs to parents of sick children, not explaining the full story, just noting, "This is why we don't give up. This is what's possible when we provide proper care and nutrition. This child was dying, and proper treatment saved him. We can save your child too." The photograph stayed on his wall for 40 years of practice, a private reminder of the child he had saved not in a modern hospital, but in a primitive camp in the Philippine jungle, armed only with determination and the belief that every child deserves a chance to live. Captain Morrison returned to teaching after the war, taking a position at a high school in Oregon where he taught American history and civics. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, but in one class each year, usually in the spring, he would tell his students about the nursery. He would describe the terrified women, the sick children, the construction project, the bridge built between enemies through acts of simple human decency. Then he would ask his students, "What does it mean to be American? Not the flag or the anthem or the documents, but what does it mean, really, to be American?" And he would answer his own question. "It means that even in war, even with our enemies, we recognize the fundamental humanity of every person. It means we build nurseries for enemy children because that's who we are. It means we hold ourselves to standards that transcend the immediate demands of conflict. That's the promise of America. Not that we're perfect, but that we're always trying to build nurseries instead of tombs, always trying to choose mercy when we have the power to choose cruelty. And when we fail to do that, we betray not just others, but ourselves." Some of his students would remember this lesson decades later, as they faced their own moral choices in their own wars and conflicts. They would remember their teacher's story about women who expected execution and found nurseries, about soldiers who built when they could have destroyed, about the stubborn insistence on maintaining humanity even when war made it seem foolish or naive to do so. This was Morrison's legacy, more enduring than any military commendation. The transmission of a story, true and documented, about the possibility of decency, even in the darkest circumstances. The nursery itself survived the war physically. It was still standing when the camp was decommissioned in late 1945. But it was just a building, and buildings can be repurposed or demolished without much ceremony. What survived more importantly was the idea of the nursery, the memory carried by those who built it and those who lived in it. The story told and retold until it became a kind of parable about the nature of moral choice in impossible circumstances. In the vast historiography of World War II, it is a footnote, a minor incident in a minor camp, involving only a handful of people and affecting no strategic outcome. But to those involved, and to those who would later hear their stories, it was everything. It was the answer to the question of what America meant, demonstrated not through words or grand gestures but through lumber and nails and the decision to build, something life-affirming in the middle of death. The 7 women who expected execution, but found nurseries carried their experience forward into the post-war world in different ways. Some remained in Japan, rebuilding their lives in a shattered nation, telling their children and grandchildren about the strange kindness of enemy soldiers. Others emigrated, seeking fresh starts in nations not haunted by war memories. But all of them, in their own ways, became witnesses to the possibility that enemies could choose mercy, that national enmity did not have to extinguish individual compassion, that even in total war certain lines could be maintained. Their testimony, preserved in interviews and memoirs and family stories, stands as evidence that the machinery of total war could not completely eliminate the capacity for human decency, that in the cracks and margins of industrial-scale violence, small acts of construction could still occur. The story of the nursery raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of war and the relationship between individual morality and collective violence. How do we reconcile the kindness shown to 7 women and their children with the firebombing of Tokyo that killed perhaps 100,000 civilians? How do we understand soldiers who built nurseries by day, while their comrades prepared for operations that would kill thousands? There is no clean answer to these questions, no resolution that makes the contradiction disappear. War contains multitudes. It is simultaneously the greatest organized evil humans have created, and the arena in which the most profound examples of human kindness sometimes occur. The nursery was real. The firebombing was real. Both are part of the historical record. Both are part of the American experience of World War II, and any honest accounting must hold both truths simultaneously without allowing one to excuse the other. The story of the nursery raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of war and the relationship between individual morality and collective violence. How do we reconcile the kindness shown to 7 women and their children with the firebombing of Tokyo that killed perhaps 100,000 civilians? How do we understand soldiers who built nurseries by day, while their comrades prepared for operations that would kill thousands? There is no clean answer to these questions, no resolution that makes the contradiction disappear. War contains multitudes. It is simultaneously the greatest organized evil humans have created, and the arena in which the most profound examples of human kindness sometimes occur. The nursery was real. The firebombing was real. Both are part of the historical record. Both are part of the American experience of World War II, and any honest accounting must hold both truths simultaneously without allowing one to excuse the other. What the nursery demonstrates, perhaps, is not that war is less terrible than we imagine, but that humans are more complex than our ideologies admit. The same nation that developed and executed the most destructive military campaign in history also produced individual soldiers who used their spare time to carve toys for enemy children. The same military machine that firebombed cities also built detailed regulations for prisoner-of-war treatment that, when followed, provided genuine protection and care. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They exist in tension, each real, each shaping the historical record and the moral legacy that we inherit. For the women who lived it, the experience of the nursery became a kind of lifelong cognitive dissonance. Sachiko wrote in her memoir about the difficulty of reconciling her lived experience of American kindness with the broader narrative of Japanese victimhood in the war, about how her fellow citizens who had not been prisoners sometimes viewed her account with suspicion, as if she had somehow betrayed the national memory by admitting that enemy soldiers had treated her with humanity. She faced accusations of having been a collaborator, of romanticizing the enemy, of failing to properly maintain the narrative of Japanese suffering. Her response was always the same. "I only tell what happened to me. I was a prisoner. I expected death. I received life. That is the truth, and I will not lie about it to make anyone more comfortable." This insistence on testimonial accuracy, on bearing witness to complexity rather than simplifying for narrative convenience, is its own form of moral courage. It would have been easier for Sachiko to remain silent, to allow her experience to be forgotten, or to reshape it to fit expected narratives. But she chose instead to preserve the memory of the nursery, to ensure that the names of the men who built it were remembered, to testify to the possibility of mercy, even when such testimony was unwelcome. In doing so, she became a guardian of a particular kind of truth, the messy, complicated, inconvenient truth that resists propaganda and ideology, that insists on the full humanity of both victims and perpetrators, that refuses to allow war to be remembered as only heroism or only atrocity, but demands that it be remembered as the complex, contradictory, deeply human phenomenon that it actually is. The children born in or brought to the nursery grew up with a story that shaped their understanding of the world. They were told about the time their mothers expected to die but were given life, about the enemy soldiers who built a safe place for them when they were vulnerable, about the strange kindness that emerged in the middle of hatred. Some struggled with this story, finding it difficult to reconcile with their identity as Japanese, with the narratives of the war they learned in school, with the anti-American sentiment that existed in some quarters of post-war Japan. Others embraced it, seeing in their mother's experience a model for how enemies might become friends, how reconciliation might be possible, how the scars of war might eventually heal. Takeshi, the infant who Albert Chen had saved, grew up to become a doctor himself, specializing in public health in developing nations. When asked why he chose that path, he would speak about his mother's story, about the American corpsman who had refused to let him die, about the debt he felt he owed to a man he could not remember, but who had changed the entire trajectory of his life. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, a small reunion was organized through the efforts of various military and peace organizations. Several of the men who had built the nursery, now elderly but still living, traveled to Hawaii to meet with several of the women who had lived in it, also elderly now, their children grown. It was an awkward gathering at first. Too much history, too much translation needed, too many emotions churning beneath polite surfaces. But when Sachiko presented Robert Williams with the cloth bag she had made 40 years earlier, still containing the carefully preserved papers with all the names, something broke open. Williams, now in his 70s, wept openly, and Sachiko wept with him, and the careful distance that decades and decorum had constructed dissolved. They were no longer enemy soldier and enemy prisoner. They were just people who had shared a moment when the world could have gone one way and instead went another, who had chosen mercy over cruelty in the small spaces where choice was possible. The reunion lasted only a weekend, and most of those who attended would not live long enough for another such gathering. But they exchanged addresses, wrote letters, maintained connections across the vast Pacific that had once been a barrier but now served as merely a distance to be crossed. Some of the children attended, now middle-aged adults themselves, meeting the men who had built the place where their mothers had survived, thanking them in careful English or through translators. Corporal Reed's daughter attended, representing her father who had died years earlier, and she met Sachiko's daughter, now a grandmother herself, who brought the wooden horse that Reed had carved, worn smooth with handling and time but still recognizable, still treasured. The two women held the toy between them, and no words were necessary to convey what it meant. Evidence of kindness, proof that even in war, even between enemies, Someone had cared enough to smooth the edges so a child would not be hurt. The historical record of the nursery is fragmentary, preserved in scattered sources rather than in comprehensive documentation. Captain Morrison's after-action reports mention the construction of appropriate housing for non-combatant female prisoners with infant children, but provide no detail about the emotional weight of the project or the reaction of the women when they saw it. The camp's engineering logs record the materials requisitioned for the construction, but say nothing about the voluntary contributions from soldiers' personal supplies. Lieutenant Mitchell's medical reports document the improvement in the children's health, but cannot capture the moment when a mother realized her child would live. The full story exists primarily in personal letters, in memoirs published decades later, in interviews conducted with survivors, in the memories passed down through families who kept alive the story of the nursery in the jungle, the enemy soldiers who built it, and the moment when propaganda met reality and shattered. This fragmentary preservation is itself significant. The nursery was not the official story of the war. It was too small, too ambiguous, too complicated. Official histories prefer clear narratives, heroic victories or tragic defeats, noble causes or villainous enemies. The nursery fits awkwardly into such frameworks because it insists on complication, on the possibility that enemies could be kind, that war could contain mercy, that the same hands that built instruments of destruction could also build cradles. Such stories are harder to tell, harder to fit into national mythologies, harder to use for clean moral lessons. But they are no less true, and perhaps they are more important precisely because they resist simplification. What the nursery represents, ultimately, is not an argument that World War II was less terrible than we remember, nor that the Japanese and American forces were morally equivalent in their conduct. The historical record is clear that atrocities occurred on all sides, that millions of civilians died, that the war unleashed suffering on a scale difficult to comprehend. The nursery does not erase or excuse any of that. What it represents instead is the stubborn persistence of human decency, even in circumstances designed to extinguish it. The possibility that individuals can make moral choices that transcend the demands of total war. The hope that even in the worst of times, people can choose to build rather than destroy when given the smallest opportunity to do so. For the soldiers who built the nursery, the experience became a touchstone in their lives, a moment they returned to when they needed to remember who they were and what they believed in. In a war characterized by industrial-scale killing, by strategic bombing of cities, by battles that killed thousands in single days, they had taken 36 hours to build something whose only purpose was to protect and nurture. It did not change the outcome of the war. It did not save thousands of lives. It was not strategically important in any conventional sense, but it mattered to 7 women and 7 children whose lives were transformed by it. And it mattered to the men who built it, because it allowed them to maintain their own humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. That alone justified its existence. The philosophical question at the heart of the nursery story is about the nature of moral obligation in total war. Did the soldiers who built it have an obligation to do so beyond what military regulations required? Was their action supererogatory, going beyond duty into the realm of voluntary moral excellence? Or was it simply what decency demanded, what any human being should do when confronted with terrified mothers and sick children, regardless of nationality or military status? Different ethical frameworks would answer these questions differently, but what is clear from the soldiers' own accounts is that they did not see themselves as performing extraordinary virtue. They saw themselves as doing what was obviously necessary, what their consciences demanded, what they could not avoid doing and still remain the people they understood themselves to be. In their view, the question was not, should we build a nursery? But rather, how could we not? This sense of moral obviousness, of acting according to values so fundamental that violation was unthinkable, stands in stark contrast to the moral compromises and atrocities that characterized much of the war. It suggests that even in total war, even when entire societies are mobilized for mutual destruction, there remain moral intuitions strong enough to resist corruption, values deep enough to maintain integrity. The soldiers who built the nursery had seen combat, had killed enemy soldiers, would continue to serve in operations designed to destroy Japanese military capacity. Yet when confronted with women and children in their power, they responded with protection rather than cruelty, with construction rather than indifference. This compartmentalization, maintaining moral standards in some domains while participating in large-scale violence in others, is psychologically complex and ethically ambiguous, but it is also profoundly human. The legacy of the nursery extends beyond the individuals directly involved, seeping into the broader cultural memory of the war and shaping how subsequent generations understand the conflict. For Americans, stories like the nursery serve a particular function in the national mythology. They provide evidence that American power, even at its most overwhelming, was tempered by values, that victory was achieved without complete moral compromise, that the nation maintained its ethical bearings even in the darkest circumstances. This is a comforting narrative, and like all comforting narratives, it requires careful scrutiny. The nursery was real, but so were the internment camps where Japanese Americans were imprisoned without trial. So were the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So were the instances of prisoner abuse that occurred despite official policy. The full accounting requires holding all of these truths simultaneously, allowing the nursery to be real without allowing it to excuse everything else. For Japanese, particularly those who lived through the war, stories like Sachiko's create different complications. They challenge the narrative of complete American brutality that some held, forcing a reckoning with the reality that enemies could be humane, that surrender did not always lead to the horrors that propaganda had promised. This cognitive dissonance was painful for many, because it meant confronting the possibility that they had been lied to by their own government, that the suicides on Saipan had been unnecessary, that the code of Bushido that demanded death over surrender had been based on a false understanding of how enemies would behave. Sachiko and others who testified to American kindness sometimes faced hostility from fellow Japanese who preferred not to complicate the narrative of Japanese victimhood with accounts of enemy mercy. But they persisted in their testimony, understanding that honest memory, however uncomfortable, was necessary for genuine reconciliation. As the last survivors of World War II die, taking their direct memories with them, stories like the nursery become increasingly important as preserved memory. They exist now not as living testimony but as documented history, as accounts preserved in archives and memoirs and family traditions. This transition from memory to history always involves some loss of nuance, some flattening of complexity, but it also allows for critical examination and contextualization. Historians can place the nursery within the broader framework of American prisoner of war policy, can compare it to treatment at other camps, can analyze what factors made such an outcome possible in this particular place at this particular time. This scholarly work is valuable, but it should not completely subsume the human core of the story. The terror, the relief, the acts of construction, the tears, the toys carved by grieving hands, the moment when propaganda shattered against the reality of kindness. The nursery was built in January 1945 and used for only a few months before its inhabitants were transferred to rear area facilities. The building itself probably survived only a few years before being torn down, or repurposed, or simply allowed to decay in the tropical climate. No physical trace of it remains today. No plaque, no monument, no marked site. Its location is approximate at best, somewhere in the Philippines, somewhere in a landscape transformed by decades of development and change. But its absence from the physical world does not diminish its presence in the historical record or its significance as a symbol of what was possible even in the worst of circumstances. Perhaps that is appropriate. The nursery was never meant to be permanent. It was built as a temporary shelter, an immediate response to an urgent need. Its importance lies not in its physical endurance, but in what it represented in the moment it existed and what it continues to represent in memory. The choice to protect rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, to recognize the humanity of the vulnerable even when they belong to the enemy. These choices are not permanent. They must be made again and again in each new circumstance, by each new generation. The nursery cannot make those choices for us. It can only stand as evidence that such choices are possible, that even in total war, even with enemies, even when power gives us the option of cruelty, we can still choose mercy. The story of the nursery ends where it began, with mothers and children, with the fundamental human drive to protect the young, with the recognition that children are always innocent, regardless of the crimes of their nations. The 7 women who expected execution but found nurseries learned something about their enemies that propaganda had tried to prevent them from knowing: that Americans, for all their faults, and despite the violence of their military operations, were still human beings capable of recognizing the humanity of others, still people who believed that mothers and babies deserved protection regardless of nationality. And the soldiers who built the nursery, for all their participation in a vast military machine designed for destruction, discovered something about themselves: that they could maintain their values even in war, that they could build even in the midst of tearing down, that they could choose to be more than just destroyers. In the end, the nursery stands in memory as a small gesture against the enormity of war, a reminder that individual choices matter even when they do not change strategic outcomes, that human decency persists even in circumstances designed to extinguish it. It is not a story that makes war less terrible or that excuses the suffering and death that characterized World War II. It is simply a story that insists on complication, on the possibility of mercy, on the stubborn persistence of values that transcend temporary enmity. It is a story about people who expected the worst of each other and instead discovered something better. And it is a story worth preserving, worth telling, worth remembering, not because it resolves the moral complexities of war, but because it reminds us that those complexities exist, that humans are always more than the worst things they do, and that even in darkness, the choice to build rather than destroy remains possible. The women wept when they saw the nursery. They wept not from pain, but from the shock of discovering they would live, that their children would be fed and protected, that their enemies had spent their strength building rather than destroying. Those tears, flowing from exhaustion and relief and the shattering of every expectation, carried within them the seeds of reconciliation that would take decades to fully flower. In that moment when propaganda met reality and broke apart, when ideology confronted the lived experience of human kindness and could not contain it, something fundamental shifted. The war would continue for months yet, but for 7 women and 7 children, and for the soldiers who built them shelter, the war had already begun to transform from absolute enmity into something more ambiguous, more human, more capable of eventual healing. The nursery was made of wood and nails and built in 36 hours, but what it really represented was built from older, stronger materials. The belief that children deserve protection, that power should be tempered by mercy, that even enemies remain human beings worthy of basic dignity. These beliefs are tested in every war, in every conflict, in every moment when we hold power over those who cannot resist us. The story of the nursery is the story of a test passed, of values maintained, of the choice to build when destruction would have been easier. It is a small story in the vast history of World War II, but it is not an insignificant one. It is the story of mothers who expected death and received life, of children who were saved by enemy hands, of soldiers who built a nursery in the middle of war, and in doing so built something larger, a testament to the possibility that humanity can survive even humanity's worst impulses, that mercy can exist even in the machinery of total war, that we can choose, always and again, to build rather than destroy.